Chapter 4. A Prisoner Again. Maximus rode fast through the German forests on Cornelius's horse. He was leading one of the other horses behind him. He had put a cloth around the cut in his shoulder, but it was bad and gave him a lot of pain. Blood ran down his arm as he rode, but he did not have time to stop. By the middle of the day he had crossed into the east of France. He rode his horse as hard as he could. He had to get home before it was too late. Into the night he continued riding, not stopping for water, food, or rest. He saw nothing as he passed through the country, and he remembered nothing. He could only think that time was passing so quickly. He became hot and tired, and decided to throw off his armor. His horse was also tired, and he knew it could not go much further. He changed horses and continued his urgent flight toward Spain and the faraway hills above Trujillo. In the light of early day, the Spanish hills around the farm and house were unbelievably beautiful. An 8-year-old boy with dark hair was in a field beside the pink stone house. He was training a wild horse, making it walk around the field. A beautiful black-haired woman watched her son working with the horse and smiled. He would have a fine riding horse by the time his father returned. The boy stopped. He saw something. Over a hill, he could just see a battle flag coming in their direction. He shouted with excitement and happiness and ran out of the field. He ran toward the flag, calling, "Father! Father!" The woman, too, looked toward the flag. But there was something about it that worried her. Something was not right, and she suddenly felt anxious. The boy continued to run along the road. Soon soldiers appeared over the hill. But they were not the Roman soldiers he expected to see. He slowed down, then stopped, confused. 20 royal guards were riding down the road, and his father was not among them. He searched their faces again, looking for his father, hoping. Behind him, his mother started shouting out his name. The horses suddenly came faster, riding over the small boy and crashing him into the dirt of the road. Then they rode straight toward his screaming mother. As the hills turned pink and gold with the sunset, a rider raced for his life, killing the horse under him. His shoulder was bleeding badly. He came to the top of a long, low hill and stopped. There was a line of thick black smoke in the distance, and he tried to see where it was coming from. With a cry of pain, he forced the horse forward, racing down the far side of the hill. Would he arrive in time? Maximus's worst dream did not equal the sight in front of him. His family home and farm were burning, completely destroyed. The wheat and the apple trees were burnt black, and smoke still curved upward from the last stones of his house. 2 pink stone chimneys were left standing. Nothing else. He stopped the horse violently. It fell over onto its side, and Maximus was thrown off. His stomach was sick with fear. He knew now what he would find. He stopped before the field of vegetables, looked up, and forced himself to breathe. There, hanging on ropes, were the burnt bodies of his wife and son. There was almost nothing left of them. He reached up with both hands to touch his wife's feet. A terrible scream came from him, and he sank to the earth. His world was now dead. Maximus dug one deep hole in the black earth on the hillside for his wife and son. He pushed the earth back over their broken, burnt bodies and cried. He looked down toward the ruin of the house he had built, to the dead apple trees. He spoke to his loved ones through his tears. "Lie in the shadow of the trees, my loves, and wait for me there." He fell onto the earth beside them. They came because they had smelled the smoke in the air. Fire meant there was something to be found and taken. These were Spanish thieves, and their chief was a big mountain man with a black beard. They found the man lying dead on the black earth. Hands touched his shoes, expensive leather shoes. Other hands moved over his soldier's clothes, fine dark red cloth. Suddenly, the dead man moved. The hands on his body stopped. Something was said in a strange language. Everyone waited. The big man on the ground did not move again. The chief made a sign to his men, and the hands roughly took hold of Maximus and pulled him away. Days and nights passed, and for Maximus it was like a never-ending feverish dream. Terrible pictures crossed his mind as he lay close to death in the open carriage they had thrown him into. He dreamed of wild animals close to his face. Then he was on a ship, traveling across water. A large African man smiled down at him. He saw views of the desert, faraway mountains, heard shouts in a strange language. It was hot, too hot to breathe. Maximus's eyes opened slowly. Centimeters away from his face was a wild tiger, and this one did not go away when he closed his eyes and opened them again. He looked around and realized that he was one of several men chained together in a slave carriage. There were small windows at the front and back and on both sides. He looked through one of the windows and saw other carriages traveling with them. Wild animals in chains were walking along with them, some close to the window that he was looking through. He fell back onto the floor, thinking, this must all be a terrible dream. When Maximus woke again, he saw 12 slaves, all chained together, all looking at him. Outside the carriage, he could hear men talking in a language he did not understand. Someone was looking down at him, a big African man. "Juba," said the African, giving his name. He too was chained. Maximus moved with great pain and saw that the sword wound on his shoulder was worse than he had realized. Juba was putting something on the wound. Maximus fell back again and slept. When he woke again, the African was still with him. "You see," he said, "now your arm is getting better. It's clean." He put his finger gently on the wound. "Don't die," said Juba. "They'll feed you to the tigers. They're more expensive than we are." Maximus stared at him, and Juba looked down with a small smile on his lips. The desert heat of Morocco was not like anything that Maximus had known. The hot air made breathing difficult. He did not care about breathing, though. Maximus did not care about anything. All around him, men were standing in the sand in a slave market. The buyers walked slowly around, looking at the men and touching them. There was a man with a black beard standing near them, calling out to tell people about his slaves. Maximus stood with the others, looking far away, beyond the people in the market. Physically, he was getting better with Juba's help, but nobody could help the darkness inside him. He did not even care about his own life. Maximus, the Roman general, Maximus the farmer and husband, was already dead. Across the market square, Aelius Proximo sat in a small, dirty cafe and watched everything with interest. Proximo was a large man with big blue eyes and white hair and beard. He looked like a man who enjoyed the good things in life. He drank his tea slowly, as a man measured his feet for new shoes. 2 slave girls sat beside him. "Proximo, my friend," said the man with the black beard. Proximo recognized the man immediately and turned away. "Every day you are here is a great day," the man said, smiling. He came to sit with Proximo. "And today is your lucky day." Proximo caught hold of his arm and held it tight. "It wasn't my lucky day the last time you sold me some animals. They're no good. They only run around and eat. Give me my money back." The slave seller tried to pull his arm away.
I'll give you a special price today, because you are unhappy, just for you. Come and see the new tigers.
Proximo let him go and followed him across the square.
Look at this one, said the man. Isn't he a beauty?
Proximo looked at the tigers through the bars.
Do they fight?
He asked.
Of course. For you, my special price. Only 8,000. For me, said Proximo, 4,000. That's my special price. 4? I have to eat.
Proximo looked around at the group of men in chains.
Do any of them fight? He said. There's a contest soon. Some are good for fighting, some for dying. You need both.
Proximo walked over to Juba.
Get up,
he commanded the big African. Juba lifted his head and looked at him. He got up slowly. Proximo looked at him carefully. He turned over Juba's hands and felt the hard skin. Then he moved on to Maximus. He saw the wound on his arm, and then he saw the mark just above it, the letters SPQR. Proximo knew that they meant Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people.
A soldier, said Proximo. Did you run away?
He asked Maximus. But Maximus said nothing.
Probably, said the slave seller. They say he's a Spaniard.
Proximo walked on and looked at the others.
I'll take 6. 1,000 for all of them, he said.
His servant handed him a small brush with red paint on it.
1,000? The slave seller cried. The African alone should cost 2,000.
He whispered to Proximo.
Turn your back on him. He'll kill you.
These slaves are no good, said Proximo as he walked away.
Wait! We can discuss the price.
Proximo made a mark in red paint on the chests of the slaves he had chosen.
I'll give you 2,000, he said, and 4 for the animals. But it will be 5,000 for an old friend.
The slave seller thought for a second, and then accepted.
But those tigers have to fight, said Proximo. Don't feed them for a day and a half, said the slave seller, and they'll eat their own mothers.
Interesting idea, said Proximo as he walked away. His servants pulled the chains tied to Juba, Maximus, and the others, and they were led away. Proximo's carriages arrived in a crowded Moroccan port city. Maximus and Juba sat together with 12 other new slaves. One was a small, very frightened Greek man. He was probably a teacher or a writer. He was definitely not a fighter. The carriage of slaves was followed by several others carrying wild animals, including the tigers. Most of the chained men looked back at the tigers from time to time, not with interest, but with fear. They knew what a hungry tiger could do, and they guessed why they and the animals had been bought together. They drove through some large iron gates. There was no sign on the gates or on the buildings inside, but everyone in the city knew the place as Proximo's school. It was not a place to learn Latin, Greek, or mathematics. It was a school where men learned how to fight, to live one more day in the face of death. It was a gladiator school. Proximo's school was like a castle prison. In the center was a square. On one side were the cages for the animals, and on the opposite side the human prisoners were kept. Maximus and the other new slaves were pushed into their prison, and the doors crashed shut behind them. Maximus noticed the guards. They all carried short swords, and some also had arrows or spears. At the far end of the square, a group of about 10 men were training. Battle practice, thought Maximus. Like Commodus. A very big man was teaching 2 new gladiators how to throw a spear. They were trying to hit a picture of a man, but they were not very good. Both students missed it. The teacher threw his spear and hit the picture in the stomach.
"Hakon," said a voice from behind, naming the teacher.
Maximus turned to see Proximo, who was admiring Hakon's strength. He and Maximus stared at each other.
"Spaniard,"
Proximo said, naming Maximus. Then he moved along the line, naming each new slave.
"Thief, murderer."
Suddenly he stopped and smiled.
"Proximo," he said. "Anyone know the meaning of that?" "Nearest, dearest, close to. I am Proximo. I shall be closer to you in the next days than your own mothers were. I did not pay good money to buy you," Proximo said. "I paid to buy your death. You may die alone, in pairs, or in groups. Who knows? Many different ways with just one ending."
He walked around his new slaves, enjoying himself.
"And when you die, and you will die, the sound of cheering will send you to the next world."
Proximo raised his hands and stretched them out to the group of slaves.
"Gladiators, I salute you," he said.
Chapter 5. New Gladiators. Proximo never missed training for the new boys. He could learn so much about them. The more experienced gladiators trained against each other, working with swords and spears and with shields and armor. The new ones were put together into a small arena in the center. One by one, they were given heavy wooden swords and sent in to face the teacher. He had a similar sword. Proximo watched from a short distance. Very quickly, his trained eye could sort the new class into two groups. The fighters were marked with red paint, and the others with yellow. Hakon enjoyed his job as gladiator teacher. He took great pleasure in knocking away the swords of his new students and then hitting them hard so they fell onto the dirt. It was soon Maximus's turn to face Hakon.
"Spaniard!"
Hakon called to him. Maximus went forward slowly. Proximo watched more closely to see what would happen. Maximus picked up the sword and stood facing Hakon. Suddenly, everyone, especially Hakon, saw that this man was a fighter. There was something about the way he held the sword, the way he stood. But most of all, there were his eyes. There was no doubt. He knew how to fight. Maximus lifted the sword and then dropped it to the ground. He seemed to be saying, "I could kill, but I choose not to." Hakon was surprised. Was this an insult? He looked to Proximo for orders. Proximo made a sign to him to continue. Hakon struck Maximus across the stomach. Maximus fell forward, but then stood straight again and faced him. Hakon looked again to Proximo, and again he was told to continue. This time, Hakon struck Maximus across his wounded arm. Maximus almost fell to the ground, but managed to stay on his feet. All the time, he stared straight at Hakon, who was becoming very angry. Maximus's thoughts were clear. "I may be low, but I'm not as low as you. I won't kill for sport." Proximo found it very interesting. Hakon lifted the sword again, ready to hurt Maximus really badly, but Proximo stopped him. "That's enough for now," he said. "His time will come." He looked behind him to the servant with the pots of paint. "Mark that one," he said. In the heat of the late afternoon, Hakon, Juba, the Greek, and the other new gladiators sat on the ground in the shadows. Maximus lay by the wall to one side. He had a small sharp stone and was using it to try to remove the letters SPQR from his arm. Juba called out to him, "Spaniard, why didn't you fight? We all have to fight." Maximus did not answer. The young Greek was very frightened.
"I don't fight," he said. "I shouldn't be here. I'm a secretary. I can write in 7 languages.
"Good," said Hakon. "Tomorrow you can scream in 7 languages." The other gladiators laughed. Juba moved closer to Maximus and watched him digging the stone into his skin. "Is that the sign of your gods?" he asked. Maximus did not answer. Behind them, Hakon was making fun of the Greek. "Maybe the secretary will be the one who wins his freedom," he laughed.
"Freedom?" the Greek replied. "What do I have to do?"
"You go into the arena, and you kill me," Hakon replied. "Then you kill him, and the African, and him, and 100 more. And when there are no more men to fight, you're free."
"I can't do that," cried the Greek.
"No," said Hakon, suddenly serious. "But I can." He looked from one gladiator to the next, until his eyes rested on Maximus. Maximus stared back at him, his face like stone. Proximo and his gladiators walked through the streets of the town on their way to the arena. Hakon and the gladiators were chained together, and Proximo's guards walked with them. They were all carrying short swords. The arena was small. It was not like the enormous Colosseum in Rome, although it was there for the same reason: to entertain the people. This arena was just a circle of sandy ground with a lot of seats around it. But the seats were filled with people, and the people were expecting to see blood. Maximus and the other gladiators were taken to a small area behind the seats. Above them were Proximo's seats, next to the seats of several other gladiator trainers. This special position gave the trainers a good view of the arena, and they could also see the gladiators preparing to fight. They discussed their gladiators together before the contest started, who would live and who would die. "Has the African fought before?" one of the men asked Proximo. "No, first time." "And that one?" he asked, pointing to Maximus. "Soldier?" "Him? He's no good," said Proximo. "But I have an idea." He called down to his guards. "Chain the Spaniard to the African," he said. The other man was not sure about Maximus. He liked the look of the Spaniard. "I think he'll live through this fight. You think he'll die," he said. "Let's put money on the result. 1,000? "Against my own man, I don't do that," said Proximo. "And if I make it 5,000? Proximo thought about it. That was a lot of money. Proximo liked to see his new boys before they went to fight. A guard called for silence as he walked into the waiting area. "Some of you are thinking that you won't fight," Proximo said, "and some that you can't fight. They all say that until they're out there." He pulled a sword down from a shelf. "Push this into another man, and the crowd will cheer and love you. You may even begin to love them back." He stuck the point of the sword in a table. "In the end, we are all dead men. Sadly, we cannot choose how. But we can decide how we accept that end, so we are remembered as men. You go out into the arena as slaves. You come back, if you come back, as gladiators." Outside, the crowd was getting impatient. Before he left, Proximo walked down the line of men, saying who must be chained together. They were all put in teams of 2, and it soon became clear that the method was to chain a red to a yellow. Each good fighter was with a certain loser. Hakon was chained to the crying Greek secretary. Maximus, a loser because he had refused to fight Hakon, was chained to Juba. Maximus turned to look at the closed door. From the other side they could hear the shouts of the crowd. Suddenly, Maximus bent down and picked up a little sand from the ground, then let it fall through his fingers. Juba watched him, but did not understand. When Maximus stood up again, he looked different. He was ready for battle. Outside, the crowds were cheering and shouting. There was the sound of drums. Everyone stood anxiously waiting. Suddenly, the doors to the arena crashed open and sunlight poured in. For a few seconds, the men were blinded by it. There were trained gladiators already in the arena, waiting, their swords and spears ready for killing. The new gladiators ran out, some to immediate death. Side by side, their chain loose between them, Maximus and Juba ran out into the arena. It was not a fair fight. The new men had only one small sword and no armor. The experienced gladiators had much better equipment. Maximus and Juba fought together. Juba was surprised to see that his partner, marked with the yellow of cowards, was fighting bravely. All the anger and pain inside Maximus had come out, and he was better than any man in the arena. He knew this was not his day to die. Not like this. Together they killed the first pair of gladiators. Others came to fight them, and for a second Juba lost his sword as he attacked. Maximus pulled him clear of the other man's sword and then struck the attacker hard. His sword point came out the man's back. He and Juba worked together as a team. They were strong and fast, and many of the attacking gladiators were killed by them. Hakon fought with great power. The Greek was soon killed, and Hakon cut off the man's hand so it was easier for him to move about in the arena. Proximo watched everything closely. The crowd quickly realized that Juba and Maximus were a strong fighting pair and began to cheer them. Soon all the attackers were on the ground. Juba and Maximus looked around and then at each other. But then, as they began to relax, one of the gladiators tried to get to his feet. They ran forward together and pulled their chain tightly around his neck. The fighting had ended. The crowd were on their feet, cheering. Maximus looked at the many bodies around him, and then at the excited faces of the crowd. It made him sick that people were entertained by the sight of men killing other men. He walked toward the entrance and threw his sword into the crowd. It only made them cheer louder. Proximo was pleased with the day's work. He had lost a lot of money, but he had found a new fighter. Chapter 6. Caesar's Arrival in Rome. It was a special day in Rome, a holiday. 50 black-armored royal guards marched down the main street of Rome, followed by hundreds of men on horses. Behind them came the royal carriage. Commodus, the new emperor of Rome, was coming home. His sister Lucilla was sitting next to him. Another 50 guards marched behind them. Close to the royal carriage, on a beautiful black horse, rode Quintus, the new commander of the royal guards. Commodus had told the Senate that he was now the commander of the Roman army, and that the army was loyal to him. Many senators doubted it, but there was no one in Rome with enough power to take control. And so nothing could stop Commodus. The people had been told that their new emperor would arrive in Rome on this date at this time. The city was cleaned up, and purple flags were hung outside the most important buildings. The citizens of Rome lined the streets at the time he was expected. The crowd was not very big, and it was not very enthusiastic. They cheered, but not loudly. Commodus was young and had no experience, but the people could forgive that. They were more worried about the stories they had heard, that Commodus was selfish and cruel. He was not his father, and they had loved Marcus Aurelius. Commodus had much work to do to make himself popular and win the support of the people. Ahead, on the steps of the Senate, a group of senators stood waiting. Falco, Gaius, and Gracchus were among them. Lucius, Lucilla's 8-year-old son, was standing with them. Senator Gracchus, a white-haired man in his 60s, was not happy about the new emperor.
He is entering Rome like a hero. But what has he ever done? He said.
Give him time, Gracchus, Falco answered. He's young. I think he could do very well.
For Rome? Asked Gracchus. Or for you?
Falco turned to Lucius. It's a proud day for all of us, isn't it, Lucius? He said. I'm sure Senator Gracchus never thought he'd live to see such a day. Lucius watched as the royal carriage came closer, then ran down the steps when it arrived. He jumped up into his mother's arms, and she held him tight and kissed him. Commodus raised his arm in salute to the crowd, but he could see that the crowd was small, and the cheering was only polite. Rome greets her new emperor, Falco said. Your loyal people are here to welcome you, sir. Thank you, Falco, replied Commodus, for bringing out the loyal people. I hope they weren't too expensive. He turned to Gracchus. Ah, Gracchus, he said, the friend of Rome. We are happy that you are home, Caesar, Gracchus said. Then he became more serious. There are many problems that need your attention. In the royal palace, Commodus was meeting with the senators. He was following his sister's advice and listening to them patiently. Senator Gracchus had a list of problems in the city. He was anxious that Commodus look at them without delay. And here are some suggestions from the Senate. Ideas for solving the problems, he said. Commodus walked around the room, losing interest. Lucilla listened carefully and watched her brother. Finally, Commodus could not listen any longer. You see, Gracchus, this is exactly the problem, he interrupted. My father spent too much time listening to the Senate, and the people were forgotten. The Senate is the people, Caesar, said Gracchus, chosen from among the people, to speak for the people. I doubt many of the people eat as well as you do, Gracchus, or have the beautiful home you have, Gaius. I think I understand my own people, Commodus said. Would Caesar kindly teach us from his own great experience, replied Gracchus. I call it love, Gracchus. I am their father. The people are my children, said Commodus. He was getting angry. Lucilla stepped forward. Senators, my brother is very tired, she said. Please, leave your list with me. Caesar will do everything that Rome needs. She called for a slave to show them out. The senators left, but they were not pleased. It was not a good start for the new emperor. When they had gone, Lucilla turned to Commodus. The Senate can be useful, she said. How? He replied. They only talk. He moved to a window and looked out over the great city. It should be just you and me and Rome. There has always been a Senate, said Lucilla. Rome has changed, he answered. It takes an emperor to rule an empire. Of course, but leave the people their traditions. It had been a tradition for the last 200 years to believe that the Senate ruled Rome through the emperor. But everyone knew the real situation. The army held the political power in Rome, and the real ruler was whoever the army was loyal to. Commodus's thoughts were moving ahead. All the years of my father's wars gave the people nothing, but still they loved him. Why? They didn't see the battles. They knew nothing of the people we fought and killed, or their countries, he said. They care about the greatness of Rome, said Lucilla. And what is that? Can I touch it? See it? It's an idea. It's something they want to believe in, said Lucilla. Commodus was suddenly excited. I'll give them something to believe in. I'll give them great ideas, and they'll love me for it, he said, raising his arms to the sky.
I will give them the greatest ideas, the most wonderful Rome ever.
There were artists at work in the streets, painting enormous pictures on walls. Their pictures showed scenes of gladiators and wild animals fighting, and the sand on the floors of the arenas was red with blood. Crowds stood and stared, watching as the pictures were completed. This was the start of the advertising for Commodus's new idea.
Games,
Gaius complained to Gracchus and a group of other senators as he joined them in a cafe.
150 days of games.
The senators watched the wall painters working outside the cafe. "He's smarter than I thought," said Gracchus quietly.
Smart, said Gaius. All of Rome would laugh at him if they weren't so afraid of his guards. You can't really think that the people will forget Rome's problems and sit back to enjoy these games? He asked. It's completely mad.
"I think he knows what Rome is," Gracchus replied. "He will give them magic, and then they'll have something else to think about. He will take their lives, and he will take their freedom, and still they will shout and cheer." He shook his head sadly. "The beating heart of Rome isn't in the walls of the Senate. It's on the sand of the Colosseum. He will give them death, and they will love him for it." The other senators knew he was right. It was a lesson from history. But they did not know that Commodus was planning better and longer games than any emperor before him. And it was all for one reason. Commodus knew he had no choice. He and the Senate did not agree about anything, and he could not be certain of their support. So he had to look beyond the Senate and go straight to the people for his power. The games were the key. As Lucilla had said, the people must have their traditions, and he would not deny his citizens their traditional games. Sitting behind the senators in the cafe, with his back to them, was a small man. None of the senators noticed him, but he was close enough to hear everything they said. The face of the listener was quite ordinary, except that his right eye was missing. He did not see well with only one eye, but he could hear perfectly, and he had a good memory. He was able to collect a lot of information, and he was paid well to repeat it to other ears. Chapter 7. The Spaniard and the Crowd. Crowds of people came down the hillside from their small houses above the Moroccan town. They were all going toward the arena, hoping to put a little excitement into their difficult lives. Maximus's arm, now without the letters SPQR, was covered with an arm guard. He had earned the extra protection of armor because of his brave fighting. He bent and picked up some dirt from the ground, watched it disappear through his fingers, and walked quickly toward the entrance to the arena. Proximo walked with him.
"You just kill, kill, kill," Proximo shouted at Maximus. "You make it look too easy. The crowd wants a hero, not just someone cutting up meat. We want them to keep coming back. Don't kill so quickly. Take more time."
The cheers of the crowd grew louder as they got closer to the arena.
"Give them an adventure to remember,"
Proximo shouted above the noise.
"Fall to one knee. They'll think you're finished. Then force yourself to your feet. Our hero."
He was rushing along to keep up with Maximus.
"Remember, you're an entertainer."
Without a word to Proximo, Maximus walked out into the arena. There was a cheer immediately. He was a known fighter now, and the Moroccans knew they were going to see some real action. Out in the bright sunlight, 6 fighters waited. Maximus looked at them and decided immediately on his method of attack. He chose the strongest and most confident man first. When that man went down, the others would know they had no chance. He cut them down, one by one, his sword striking through their bodies with great speed. It was all finished in a few minutes. The crowd stood and cheered. They shouted, "Spaniard! Spaniard!" Proximo got up from his seat and walked out. Maximus dropped his arm to his side, stepped over a body, and walked back toward the exit. He picked up a sword from the sand and threw it into the crowd. As it fell to the floor, the screaming crowd grew silent, watching and waiting.
"Are you not entertained?" Maximus shouted at them. "Is this not why you came?"
He threw down his own sword and walked out of the arena gates and back to the prison area. In the cool of the evening, Maximus and Juba stood inside the gates of Proximo's school. They looked out over the desert to the mountains in the distance.
"My country. It's somewhere out there," Juba said. "My home. My wife is preparing food, and my daughters are carrying water from the river. Will I ever see them again? I think not."
"Do you believe you'll meet them again after you die?" Maximus asked.
"I think so," Juba said. "But I will die soon. They will not die for many years."
"But you would wait for them?"
"Of course," Juba said.
"I almost died coming here," said Maximus. "You saved me. I never thanked you." Maximus looked at Juba, and there was pain in his eyes. "Because my wife and my son are waiting for me." Juba understood.
"You'll meet them again," he said. "But not yet, yes?"
He laughed. This team was not ready for death. Later that evening, 2 guards came to find Maximus. They took him to Proximo.
"Ah, Spaniard," he said, sending the guards away. "It worries me that although you're good, you could be better. You could be the greatest."
"You want me to kill? I kill," Maximus said. "That's enough." He turned to walk out.
"Enough for a small Moroccan town like this," Proximo called after him. "But not for Rome."
Maximus stopped. "Rome?" he said, suddenly interested.
"My men have just brought the news," Proximo said. "The young emperor has arranged some games in honor of his dead father, Marcus Aurelius. It's strange to think that I had to leave my school in Rome years ago because his father stopped all gladiator contests. But his day has ended now."
"Yes," said Maximus, quietly, angrily.
Proximo laughed. "We're going back. After 5 years in this terrible place, we're going back to the Colosseum," he said. "Ah, Spaniard, wait until you fight in the Colosseum. 50,000 Romans following every move of your sword. The silence before you strike. The cry that comes after, like a storm."
He stopped and looked to the heavens, his eyes shining. Maximus saw the memories lighting up Proximo's face, and suddenly he understood. "You were once a gladiator," he said. Proximo looked back at him.
"The best," he said.
"You won your freedom?" Maximus asked.
"A long time ago."
Proximo went into the next room and came back carrying a small wooden sword.
"The emperor gave me this, a sign of freedom. He touched me on the shoulder, and I was free."
On the handle of the sword was Proximo's name and the words, "Free man, by order of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius." "I, too, want to stand in front of the Emperor, as you did."
"Then listen to me," said Proximo. "Learn from me. I was not the best because I killed quickly. I was the best because the crowd loved me. Win the crowd, and you'll win your freedom."
Maximus knew that he was right. "I'll win the crowd. I'll give them something they've never seen before." In the royal palace, Commodus stood looking down at Lucius, asleep in his bed. Lucilla entered quietly behind him. She stood in the doorway, watching, worried. "He sleeps so well because he is loved," said Commodus, gently brushing a hair from Lucius's face. Lucilla moved forward quickly. Lucius turned over, and she thought he was waking. "Shh! Go back to sleep now," she said. She pulled his blanket closer and watched him breathe deeply, already dreaming again. "Come, brother, it's late," she said, turning away and knowing he would follow her. Back in his own room, Commodus sat on the bed and picked up a document. He looked at it, then let it fall to the floor. The table next to his bed was covered in other papers, plans for the new Rome and documents from the Senate. "I can't sleep," he complained. "The Senate is always sending me papers, and my own dreams for Rome are making my head ache." Lucilla prepared a drink for him, secretly mixing in some medicine. "Quiet, brother. This will help." She held out the drink to him and watched as he drank it. "Are the people ready for me to close the Senate yet? What do you think? Should I have the senators killed? Some, or all of them?" he asked Lucilla. "We'll talk about it tomorrow. Sleep now," she said. She thought to herself, "Rome is in frightening hands. Thank the gods that I am here to control him." "Will you stay with me?" Commodus asked Lucilla. "Still afraid of the dark, brother?" Lucilla smiled gently, kissed him, and then started to go. She stopped at the door and looked back. Commodus lay on the bed, a lonely figure, his eyes wide open. "Sleep, brother," Lucilla said. "You know my dreams would bring terror to the world," he said. Lucilla left. When she was certain that Commodus was asleep, Lucilla quietly left the palace. She went to Senator Gracchus's house, and there, in the darkness, Gaius was waiting for her. He took her arm and led her into the house, where Gracchus met them in the hall. He turned to Lucilla. "Do you know, there was a time not very long ago when I held 2 children on my knee," he said with a kind smile. "They were the most beautiful children I'd ever seen, and their father was very proud of them. I, too, loved them, very much like my own." "And they loved you," said Lucilla. "I saw one of them grow strong and good," Gracchus continued. "The other grew dark. I watched as his father turned away from him. We all turned away from him. And as he became more and more lonely, there was more hate than love in his heart." Gracchus shook his head sadly. They went into the main room, and Gracchus gave his guests glasses of wine. Lucilla spoke first. "Anyone who says anything against the emperor is in danger now," she said. "Students, teachers, writers. We must be careful." "All to feed the arena. I'm afraid to go out after dark," said Gaius. "You should be more afraid in the day," said Gracchus. "The Senate is full of Falco's spies." He took a glass of wine and sat next to Lucilla. "What is in Commodus's mind? These games are all he seems to care about." "And how is he paying for them?" asked Gaius. "They must cost a fortune each day, but we have no new taxes." "The future is paying," Lucilla answered. "He started selling the wheat we have saved. In 2 years' time, the people will die of hunger. I hope they're enjoying the games now, because soon these games will be the reason their children are dead." "This can't be true," said Gaius. "Rome must know this."
"And who will tell them?" asked Lucilla. "You, Gaius? Or you, Gracchus? Will you make a speech in the Senate, and then see your family killed in the Colosseum?"
She looked from one man to the other.
"He must die,"
she said. "Quintus and the guards would take control themselves," said Gaius. "And we haven't got enough men. The army may not be loyal to us," said Gracchus. "No, we must wait, prepare, and be ready. We can do nothing while he has the support of the people. But every day he makes more enemies. One day he will have more enemies than friends, and then we will strike. Until then, we must be patient." Proximo and his gladiators were near Rome by late afternoon. Proximo could see that something had changed since he left 5 years before. Rome had become an army camp. When they were inside the city walls, he noticed other things. The city was poorer and dirtier than he remembered it. At last they arrived at Proximo's old school, where the gates were still locked as he had left them. The gladiators were glad to get out of the box they had traveled in. They looked around. Across the rooftops of Rome, only a short distance away, was an enormous building, the great Colosseum. Maximus, Juba, and the others stared at it, listening to the sound of 50,000 voices shouting for blood. Each man was thinking, "Is that where I die?" From the great arena came another sound. "Caesar! Caesar!" Proximo knew this meant that the emperor had just arrived. He looked across at Maximus. "Win the crowd," he said softly. Maximus had only one thought. He is there. He is close. The time is coming when I will see him myself. The man I live to kill. It was late morning of the following day when Maximus and the other gladiators were taken to the Colosseum. They were put into cages under the seats of the arena. Crowds of people came past to look at the new fighters, to guess which ones were winners and which would die. Maximus sat at the back of the cage, taking no notice of them. He could hear Proximo talking loudly to a man called Cassius, whose job was to organize the contests in the Colosseum. He also had to please the emperor. "The emperor wants battles," Proximo shouted. "My men are highly trained single fighters. I refuse to let them die like that. They will be wasted in this stupid piece of theater." "The crowd wants battles, so the emperor gives them battles," Cassius replied. "And your gladiators are going to act the Battle of Carthage. You have no choice." Their voices grew quieter as they walked away. Among the passing crowds were some young boys from rich families, watched by their servants. Maximus took no notice of them, until a voice suddenly made him turn his head. "Gladiator!" It was one of the boys, fair-haired and about the same age as Maximus's son. "Gladiator, are you the one they call the Spaniard?" he asked. Maximus moved closer to the boy. "Yes," he said. "They said you were enormous. They said you could squeeze a man's head until it broke with just one hand," said the boy. Maximus looked down at his hand. "A man's? No," he said. He held out his hand and smiled. "But maybe a boy's." The boy smiled back. "I like you, Spaniard," he said. "I shall cheer for you." Maximus was shocked. "They let you watch the games?" he asked. "My uncle says they will make me strong," the boy replied. "But what does your father say?" "My father's dead." The boy's servant came to him and took his hand. "Come, Lucius, it's time to go." "Your name's Lucius?" asked Maximus. "Lucius Verus, like my father," Lucius said proudly. He turned and left, followed by the servant. With a shock, Maximus suddenly realized that the boy must be Lucilla's son. He searched the crowd. Was Lucilla somewhere out there? But although he kept looking, he could not see her. He could only see the faces of people who were thirsty for blood.